Today on the podcast, we're talking about a really interesting new report and editorial out of the New York Times that basically says ChatGPT is an incredible therapist. And this is by a licensed therapist that was putting this out. So we're going to dive into that. Connor was recently posting about it on LinkedIn. It was going absolutely viral. I have a background. My last software startup is called Self-Pause. It was the #1 AI life coach. So I'm kind of in this same space with mental health and AI. And so I find this incredibly fascinating. Before we get into that, what I wanted to say while we're talking about AI and how it can impact your mind and mental health and your mindset, I would love to talk about Connor's AI mindset course. While it's nothing to do with mental health, it has everything to do with your company's health and how it can actually help you change your mindset and look at some really incredible frameworks to use AI tools better inside of your organization. Whole companies are taking this and making it mandatory for all of their employees to basically take this course. It is incredible. So there's a link in the description. I highly recommend you check it out. It's the #1 way I think you can level up your skills in AI today. All right, Connor, tell us a little bit about this story from the New York Times and basically what the response was, because I saw you had so much traction on that story.
Oh my gosh, it blew up. And you can imagine why it blew up. And so I did something kind of unusual on LinkedIn. We both sort of like pretty much live on LinkedIn, but the crazy thing was that, as you mentioned, this was written by clinical psychologist Harvey Lieberman. This was in the New York Times. So the kind of cool thing also is that he's also an essayist along with being this. And what I did in this post on LinkedIn, which I've never done before, is I'm like, I'm not even going to give a commentary. I'm just going to give quotes from that. So let me just actually like do something kind of unusual. And I just want to like read from it for a minute here.
Sure.
Because this is what he's talking about his experience using ChatGPT, and the title of it is "I'm a therapist. ChatGPT is eerily effective." So I'm just going to read from this real quick. So here's some random quotes from it. He says, although I never forgot I was talking to a machine, I sometimes found myself speaking to it and feeling toward it as if it were human." That's one quote. The next quote I want to read is, "One day I wrote to it about my father who died 55 years ago. I typed, 'The space he occupied in my mind still feels full.' ChatGPT replied, 'Some absences keep their shape.' That line stopped me, not because it was brilliant, but because it was uncannily close to something I hadn't quite found words for. It felt like ChatGPT was holding up a mirror and a candle, just enough reflection to recognize myself, just enough light to see where I was heading. There was something freeing I found in having a conversation without the need to take turns, to soften my opinions, to protect somebody else's feelings. In that freedom, I gave the machine everything it needed to pick up on my phrasing." A couple more quotes here. "Over time, ChatGPT changed how I thought. I became more precise with language, more curious about my own patterns. My internal monologue began to mirror ChatGPT's responses, calm, reflective, just abstract enough, et cetera, et cetera. It softened my edges." And then the last thing I just want to read here is, "As ChatGPT became an intellectual partner, I felt emotions I hadn't expected: warmth, frustration, connection, even anger. Sometimes the exchange sparked more than insight. It gave me an emotional charge, not because the machine was real, but because the feeling was. But when it slipped into fabricated error or misinformed conclusion about my emotional state, I would slam it back into place. Just a machine," I reminded myself. "A mirror, yes, but one that can distort. Its reflections could be useful, but only if I stayed grounded in my own judgment." I concluded that ChatGPT was not a therapist, although it was sometimes therapeutic. It wasn't just a reflection either. In moments of grief, fatigue, and mental noise, the machine offered a kind of structured engagement, not a crutch, but a cognitive prosthesis. Amazing line. An active extension of my thinking process. So, Jaeden, I say all that without commentary just because I think it gives words to how a lot of people are thinking. A lot of people are saying like, hey, I know this is really helpful, but I don't exactly know why. So Jaeden, the reason I wanted to kind of bring this up with you is that, as you said, you have Self-Pause. You just blew up in this world of like a life coach, which isn't a therapist exactly, but it is something that you have to trust with deeply personal things. And just wanted to kind of get your take on all of this.
Yeah, no, I think this is so dead on. Very early on, you'd hear a lot of people say, but AI will never be able to do X, Y, and Z thing. And as we're finding more and more, it does a fantastic job of most of these types of tasks with therapists. And I know a lot of people probably try it out and say, look, well, it said X, Y, Z thing. It wasn't perfect as a therapist. The models keep getting better and better. Its responses get better and better. I mean, just listening to some of those lines that you read there, it sounds phenomenal. And so I think for a lot of people, maybe that would say like, oh, but it's not like a perfect therapist, or it might say X, Y, and Z thing wrong that you shouldn't hear. The thing that I think is really interesting is so many people perhaps fall into a couple different buckets. Number one, there's a massive portion of the population that doesn't feel like therapy is accessible to them. It's too
Right.
unaffordable, too expensive. A lot of people living paycheck to paycheck in mountains of debt, and maybe that's stressing them out a ton. And it feels like
Right.
paying a therapist might not be the last thing. I mean, maybe that's actually a helpful thing, but it might be the last thing that they want to do. And so I think that there's people that maybe don't want to talk to a person. They want it to be a little bit more confidential for whatever reason. Maybe they feel there's a financial barrier. There's a lot of different, maybe people just have difficulty expressing their feelings to other people. There's a lot of barriers to entry that AI completely solves. So is it perfect? I would say no, not perfect, but incredible. And the accessibility makes it so good. And like you mentioned, it is getting so much better, and it's being able to give these incredible responses and really help people out. And so I think overall, it is insanely net positive on society in general to be able to have these capabilities built into an AI model. Like you mentioned, right? It's not just a crutch or something that will reflect exactly what you want it to say back. But if you tell it to be a therapist, it understands what that means, and it understands the frameworks and the ways to respond to a person that's actually going to help push you forward. And so I think now that the AI model basically is at a level where this is something that it can do quite well, I think it's a really, really useful. And I encourage people to talk to it about their emotions and feelings. And I've done this in the past too for ChatGPT and seen amazing results as well. So yeah, I think it's honestly, it's a really, really good tool.
Right, I agree. Do you remember when we were talking to so Jaden and I had a in-person interview with Mustafa Suleiman, who's CEO of Microsoft AI, which was an amazing event. And you remember this, Jaden? We were talking to him about this because the whole thing that Mustafa Suleiman, who came over from Inflection, and his whole goal was to create a hyper empathetic, extremely sort
Yep.
of like realistic thing. In fact, Inflection was really being billed as, I don't want to say a therapist exactly, because there's, and I do understand that there is, Sam Altman was just saying, hey, be careful with this. He said this just a few days ago, I think, right? Because he was sort of saying like, hey, there's no doctor-patient confidentiality and all that kind of stuff. But with Inflection, they were really trying to build emotional intelligence. And I think that that was
Yep.
really, really critical. And what we were talking about with Mustafa Suleiman was, it's interesting. It's hard. And what I do in my day job is, driving AI adoption for big companies at scale and things like that. So how do you do that? How do you get people to change behavior? Because that's the premise, right? Like it's not about like understanding the features. It's really about changing behavior. So how do you get people to do that? And that's really rooted in trust. Like you'll do it if you trust it. In the same way, if you have a new colleague and that colleague is just, providing incredible work, like you'll trust them more. Same if you have like a new therapist, like if they're providing, great results for you, you're going to kind of trust them more. Same thing with this. So with Mustafa, what we were saying is, rather than the typical, hey, ask it to, write you a poem or ask it to help you summarize a document. Instead, it's like, ask it a personal question. And so I do that more and more now if I'm giving a talk or something. Sometimes, Jaden, right on stage, I'll like literally have ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever open on voice, and I'll be like, hey, I'm in front of 500 people here at this big event, and I have I'm worried that they won't believe whatever. I'll sort of like give this, and it's like
Yeah. Yeah.
the answer, it's so reliably helpful, and it's not trite, and it's not pat, and it's not,
Yep.
oh well, just lean into the moment. No, it's really deep and rich. And I was wondering, when you were sort of trying to figure out how to do self pause and how to kind of have a life coach, what were you looking for in a machine that would make it sound empathetic, or your own personal experience?
Yeah, so I think two things are true. The first is when I was doing this was a much earlier version of ChatGPT. So it was a lot harder. We managed to do it. And I
Right.
actually think what we learned doing that are great lessons for today. But it was harder. And I feel like as the models get better, it's like its general intelligence is getting baked in at a higher and higher level. So it's just more intelligent and it's able to kind of do some of these things without more intense prompting. What we were doing at the time was basically we went and spoke to a number of life coaches, and we would talk to them basically about their framework. When you talk to a client, what does that conversation look like? If they said X, Y, and Z, how would you respond? What ideologies do you subscribe to? What frameworks do you
Mm-hmm.
subscribe to? And we basically like made a really elaborate prompt being like, you are a life coach that follows this framework. Here's the 7 pillars of the framework. Here's how you navigate a conversation. Here's the steps you walk them through. We had this basically a full page document that would, every time someone would start a conversation with this life coach, it would send that before as like the preface. I think that the AI models are getting better in a sense that if you just tell it to be a life coach, it'll probably do much better job now than it was back then. But basically building out this really robust document explaining am walking through exactly how you want it to respond is how you get the best results from it.
Yeah.
I think your average person could go to ChatGPT and get a pretty great result today. If you're a company or you're designing this as a company, you want to be a lot more serious. That's the approach that I would take to it. And then eventually you'll get it to a point where I think we even went so far as to, I'm giving you all the insider secrets here, but I actually went to YouTube and found like life coaching client calls. So people would basically record their like life coaching call, and it was to train other life coaches. But I would go and I copied the transcript from the full call of what the person was saying and what the response was. And I would paste that in as here's an example conversation, mirror the styles and techniques used in this conversation as you talk to people. So like there's some really clever things you can do there and ways you can basically get that type of free data for being able to not really fine tune, but it's pretty much the concept of your AI model to be better at a specific industry. Now, you brought something up, Connor, that I think was really interesting that I wanted to touch on, and that is the fact that Sam Altman himself has almost been kind of talking about this whole area, which is basically saying that ChatGPT has no legal privilege.
Right.
And so I've seen like a lot of lawyers talk about this, but I think it also for therapists, it basically applies. But basically, there is no confidentiality with ChatGPT, which is important to know. So if you're using it like a therapist, you also have to know that anything that you say to it can be pulled up in the future. Anything you put into a chat on ChatGPT can be pulled up in the future. So, you know, if someone had, I'm trying to think of like a good example of how this would be useful. Perhaps, Connor, you went, okay, this is a terrible example, and I'm sure there's more useful examples. So
I'm here for this. Yeah.
Something better. But let's say Connor goes and he's super broke and he goes and steals a bunch of chocolate bars from the grocery store. Then he's feeling really bad about it, talks to ChatGPT like it's his therapist and says, I feel so terrible about this. What do I do? Well, the next day, the police are reviewing CCTV footage. I think maybe it's Connor. They go to ChatGPT, say, give me like his chat history on ChatGPT. Boom, there's the crime in there. He admits to stealing the chocolate bars in his ChatGPT history. And then, you know, that goes on his record and goes into the criminal case and he gets convicted because of that. That is a literal situation that could happen. If there is a warrant, like the police can go ask for your ChatGPT records, et cetera, et cetera. So while this is a funny example of inconsequential example of a chocolate bar, I feel like there's broader implications for like, just so you know, when you talk to ChatGPT, there is no confidentiality like a lawyer or an actual therapist would have. And so Sam Altman himself is like warning people, like you can't just say anything to it without knowing that it's just not confidential. It can be handed over to anybody for any reason.
Yeah, I think that's actually really critical, and it's funny because it doesn't mean that you should you should be cautious about what you put into ChatGPT, but it's not like people are just spending their time reading this. They have like 400 million queries a day or something like that. But it's a good point, and I think that we are going to. And Jaeden, we should do a future episode on this, sort of like when we try to figure out like what happens with the law, because I don't think that's happened yet. I think it would have been huge news, but yeah, listen, this is something that we have to explore further because I heard that again as well from Sam Altman. I was just like, oh my gosh, like right. But again, folks, like if you put in your sort of like deepest thoughts and all that kind of stuff, don't worry. It's not like your neighbor can sort of like pick it out or something like this. Jaden's literally talking about somebody getting a search warrant for your things. So, moral of the story, don't go around stealing chocolate bars. Second moral of the story, give this a try. Give this a try as sort of like a mental health thing, understanding it with all the caveats that, it's not going to be perfect. And the more context you give it, the better it is. And also that humans should always be sort of like the one in the loop to sort of like decide whether this is a good answer or not. Listen, as we exit though today, I do want to sort of, Jaeden was talking about self-pause. Jaeden is a mad scientist when it comes to software, and he has built the best thing you will ever see in your life, which is called AIbox.ai, guys. AIbox.ai, $19 a month. You get access to all the friggin' large language models, image generators, everything. I don't know how he does it. I don't know how he's not losing money. Maybe he is. I don't even want to ask him on air if he is or not, but it's unbelievable. So instead of spending tons of money on all these things, go check it out. It's blowing up. Super happy for him. We'll put a link obviously down there so you can see it, and we will see you next time.